Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Better Than the Cure, Preventing Intimate Partner Violence. My name is Yawa Edie. I am the Program Coordinator for Africa Center's Enhancing Gender Equity Program. Today, we have a very special guest with us. As you know, this is a podcast that will feature a series of guests from different fields and sectors, all with knowledge and expertise on the factors, impacts, and consequences of intimate partner violence, specifically within African, Black, and Caribbean communities here in Alberta. As I mentioned, today we have Dr. Sophie Yohani, originally from Tanzania. She's a professor and registered psychologist with a background in counseling psychology, global mental health, elementary education, and experience in community psychology, program development, and community-based research. So very, very accomplished, and I'll let her tell us a little bit more about herself before we jump into today's conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Yao, for having me. It's such a pleasure to spend the afternoon having this conversation with you. So, you've already introduced me, and maybe I'll just speak a little bit about my recent involvement with the program that we're involved with through the Africa Center. And it's a partnership between myself and colleague Dr. Philomeno Keke, Ejirika, and Africa Center, taking time to really begin to examine intimate partner violence and its relationship to the experiences and needs and challenges faced by members of the Black African communities in Alberta.
Yeah. And it's really great to have you on today, especially as a mental health professional, especially working with a lot of the marginalized communities who this project has been meant to serve. So we have a few questions for you today, and we're really hoping to get some insight from the mental health aspect and to really shed some light on some of the underlying, mental health mechanisms or what immigrants or, African, Black, or Caribbean communities are facing when it comes to intimate partner violence, but also immigrating to Canada and finding their footing in Canada. And actually, when I was doing some research, I kind of came across something that was really interesting, the healthy immigrant effect, which is a little bit of a paradox because, you imagine when people are coming to, Canada or the Western world from conditions of either poverty or persecution or just hardship, that you assume their life will be better once they get to Canada. But the healthy immigrant effect kind of touches on their health actually declines when they come here, which is a little bit counterintuitive. Yes. So I think maybe we can start there and maybe what are the implications of that, or what have you seen with immigrants, working with immigrants here?
Yes, fantastic way to begin. So those of us who work in the area of health or public health, mental health, are familiar with the healthy immigrant effect and this sort of paradox that is experienced by immigrants as when they come to Canada. Research has shown that when they arrive, health is good, and that their health is in fact generally better off than those who are born in Canada. But as time goes by, their health declines and becomes sort of similar to maybe some of the issues that are faced by people within who are born here. And it speaks to some of the particular challenges that people encounter once they arrive here. And also, of course, we also know that as an immigrant, if you migrate to Canada, you do have to pass a medical exam. Yeah. And so, you have been selected, with a probably better health coming in. But I think what's fascinating about this is the decline in health and what's concerning about that. And we also see that in mental health as well. Some research that shows depression, people sort of report incidents of depression with time. As
increased rates.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So it tells us that there are particular factors associated in the post-migration context that need to be considered. And we call these sort of the social determinants of health.
Right.
The various factors that contribute, social, economic, other factors that generally contribute to people's stressors and well-being, and generally a decline in their overall health. So what we're looking at here is underlying stressors that are also influencing health and mental health.
And this looks different for immigrants as opposed to maybe other citizens of the country. So what do you think are some unique challenges that immigrants face, especially when it comes to their mental health, that maybe aren't as common or aren't as specific to other groups of people?
Okay, lovely. So I'm going to sort of backtrack a little bit and also kind of note that this week is Mental Health Week. Yeah. So fantastic that we're talking about mental health. By just saying we're talking about sort of immigrant mental health and factors that are associated with well-being for immigrants, at the center of that is the migration experience. So what sets us apart, and myself, I'm an immigrant, first generation, and what sets us apart maybe for people generally is this idea of migration and what comes with that. So within the mental health field and migration studies, we look at mental health as being influenced by pre-migration experience, transmigration, what happens during the transmigration journey, where else that they, where they lived before they came here, what that was like, and then post-migration factors. And so we were talking a little bit about the healthy immigrant effect, and that's really starting to look at post-migration factors. But just the fact of being an immigrant, there's movement. And for the most part, particularly those who have a choice in the migration process, it is a journey of hope, and people are excited about the possibilities and opportunities that migration will open for them. But if I can borrow from the words of, or paraphrase from Abdul Razak Gunnar, who recently he's from Zanzibar and won the Nobel Peace Prize. A lot of his literature that he writes about are stories of immigrants. And he talks about one of the unique, regardless of the migration journey that brought you to the country that you're living in as an immigrant, one thing that we share in common is the experience of loss. We've all lost or left something or someone or a situation behind.
Many things, yeah.
And so that is a factor that is there. And how we deal with that and other complications that might come up in our life is something that we just need, we can all relate to that. Now let's add other factors that might be contributing to a person's, overall experience. Pre-migration, where the journey or the migration journey was forced. You're escaping conflict and violence. There have been losses already in the countries of origin. And we know that is the case for many of our community members. And that can be a factor in a person's migration journey. People escape and their countries, or sometimes the journey of migrating doesn't necessarily involve leaving the country of origin and landing in Canada. They may spend time in other locations. And the precarity of the life that they lived in the transit countries can also be a contributing factor to their overall well-being and health. And then finally, post-migration. Now we're looking at sort of the immigrant experience in relation to resettlement and integration into a new life and into a new homeland. And it is associated, again, while there's a lot of positives and people overall, a lot of the research we do, people of African origin or Black, individuals will talk about that I don't regret necessarily coming, but there are challenges that I encounter. And some of these are acculturation related, language challenges, adapting to a new culture, but there are also challenges regarding your positionality that you have. If you come for example, arriving in Canada as a member of a racialized minority group, then you are also exposed to other stresses that might be related to your own position. Racism, for example, anti-Black racism is a major stressor, and lots of research has already identified that as a factor that contributes to mental health challenges. Difficulties with having your educational credentials recognized, employment, the de-skilling that happens. And so all of those are now we're talking about those social determinants of health that are influencing not just physical health, but also mental health and well-being. And
I love that you've broken it down into pre-trans and post-migration, because I think a lot of the time when we analyze or take a look at, an immigrant experience, it's mainly been focused on the post-migration. Now you're here, what can we help you with now that you're here? But a lot of the perhaps trauma or mental health issues or stresses actually starts, like you mentioned, from that pre-migration process, whether it was forced, whether it was voluntary, and transmigration too. Did you come straight here to Canada? Did you have to make certain stops, and what happened along the way? So when we zone in on the post-migration process, immigrants, they've come here, they've settled down, but it's difficult. How do you think that this now plays a role when we take a look at intimate partner violence? And you mentioned a lot of factors such as the acculturation, learning, you have to learn a new language, which maybe affects, can you get a job? Can you support your family? And what happens if you can't achieve those things?
Yeah. And so because we're talking about intimate partner violence today, we are going to be talking about challenges. And I want to kind of put that in the context of there's a lot to celebrate, and there's a lot of fantastic things that are happening in people's lives and in our communities. But one area in which the stressors may show is in the realm of the family, in the home. And this is and part of the project that we have been involved in with addressing sort of gender and intimate partner violence is looking at sort of the intersections between the migration experience and how that might actually be influencing or contributing to what is experienced in the home. Most of the traditional sort of approaches to looking at intimate partner violence often focus on the behavior itself. The behavior that somebody's behaving badly, somebody's lost control of themselves, and you know, and so the interventions have often focused on, okay, let's address sort of the psychological, behavioral, emotional sort of impacts and or what's behind that. When we start to look at sort of immigration and the experiences of members of the Black, African, and Caribbean communities within a migration perspective, then we start to see what are some of the stressors and tensions that families are experiencing that might also underlie the behaviors that starts to show up. What are some of the tensions? And so some of the research that we've done at literature reviews looking at experiences of intimate partner violence in Black Canadian communities. First of all, there's very little research that's done, but what we're beginning to see in the research that's been conducted is that the tensions and stressors that families face in the migration process, resettlement and integration, are also behind some of what's happening.
Interesting.
So this can be challenges that we talked a little bit earlier with lack of credentials being recognized, and so people experiencing de-skilling in their pre-migration sort of professions, and so having to kind of go out and find jobs that perhaps they weren't used to, or facing enormous financial challenges and stressors within the home context. And when we know that for any couple, financial challenges is often one of the main areas that cause conflict.
100%.
Yeah. And so here's a situation which some of the factors that could have been prevented if, for example, a person's credentials were recognized, that they were able to obtain employment, perhaps that wouldn't have led to the level of stress that a family is under. Another sort of area that often comes up is just looking at culture, the general sort of transition. Transitioning to a new country, culture changes that happen. The acculturation process involves adapting to a new culture. And so if your pre-migration, like I'm talking about a huge, variety of culture, groups, and we're talking broadly here, but depending on the roles that people had in the home, and adapting to a new country where, first of all, people have lost many of the social supports and networks that would have held people together as they adapt to perhaps new roles, where, for example, perhaps a man is spending more time at home looking after the children because the mother or his wife is the one who's able to immediately obtain a job within their profession or as a means of ensuring that the family has income. This might be a shift in a family that is a stressor for all. Now, for some, that could be actually a wonderful and welcome change. That, I've discovered that I enjoy spending more time with children, and this is something that I'm enjoying. But also that can be a real stressor and a strain, and we don't spend enough time looking at the impacts that can have on a person's identity and sense of their own self as they're trying to rebuild their life in a new homeland. And that can also contribute to some of the underlying tensions that can happen within a household.
100%. So when we take a look at these factors and everything you just mentioned, which seems to be almost like a common theme with a lot of immigrants, so how can mental health interventions be combined with knowing what we know in terms of the stressors and the strains that can happen on a family and the family breakdown can occur? How can mental health resources or interventions be combined with intimate partner violence prevention programs so that both are being addressed, not necessarily even at the same time, but we know if we address these issues of, finances or cultural breakdowns or social networks, that can lead to maybe a decrease in IPV rates. So Do you think there can be a better integration between the two supports and interventions?
Yes. So traditionally, sort of mental health supports used to be sort of you come in later as a mental health practitioner, and your job is to work individually, for example, with a person perhaps who's been charged with perpetrating intimate partners violence,
domestic violence,
and they're mandated to attend therapy, and therapy would be addressing something like anger.
Right.
Right? Let's address anger, and anger management, or and while that might be important and necessary, that a person did need to learn ways of managing their stress and their anger, it's not addressing sort of the broader sort of context of where this has emerged. And so I really think that the sort of a collaboration between different sectors that address some of the broader concerns that are emerging around sort of the experiences of African, Black, and Caribbean community members would require more sort of collaborative efforts between, let's say, mental health practitioners and other individuals who can support and provide. I would say this really addresses the issue from a more holistic perspective. Prevention is just as important and perhaps more important than intervention.
Right.
And I think, and speaking from my own profession, I think that for a while we had sort of overemphasized intervention,
right,
whereas prevention is critical. And the issue, I think, of intimate partner violence, the concerns that communities are facing are related to integration as a result of migration. That requires prevention. And so some of the work around raising awareness around the sources of our concerns, working with different sectors to address the sources of concerns, listening to different perspectives on the issue, whether we're working directly with victims of intimate partner violence, other members of the community, different age groups who are affected by this in 100%. Different ways, that's going to be critical. It is often seen as a very private or individual sort of issue that happens in a household, but actually the impact is on a community.
As a whole, exactly.
Yeah. And so a community focus is actually something that also is really important, I would say.
And I love that you mentioned community, and I'll circle back to that, but you mentioned a great point earlier where you said prevention is just as, if not more important, which is the whole kind of point of this podcast, better than cure, preventing intimate partner violence. And it's very interesting that you mentioned normally or historically, mental health practitioners, you come in after the fact, after, the behavior was done to target, anger issues, which as you mentioned, maybe there is a need to manage anger, but that doesn't naturally or effectively tackle the cause of the anger, which is the stress of potentially not having a job, not being able to, work, not being able to learn the language. There's kind of broader causes to what could be causing, the IPV. So I'm really appreciative that you mentioned that. And in terms of preventing intimate partner violence, higher collaboration is obviously ideal. So what do you think, what role can community organizations, because as you mentioned, IPV is not just an individual or even a family issue, it affects the broader community as a whole. So how can community organizations rally their efforts to, whether it's collaborate or to also establish their own supports on preventing, and not just interventing, but preventing intimate partner violence? Yeah,
I really believe that prevention is the role for everyone, even though, mental health practitioners and social service providers often are involved in prevention, but this could be something that is uplifted by the whole community. And community organizations are often sort of the first place, perhaps, in which our community members are seeking particular supports. And so that's an important sort of entry point for conversations and for information and for raising awareness around some of the concerns that we have. I think that collaborating with different groups of people who play different roles at different points in the issue of intimate partner violence, whether it's police, the criminal justice system, whether it's schools, whether it's social services, all of them come in at particular points.
Right.
And that collaborative effort to say, what is it that I do and why I come in and my role in this, I think is really important for community members to be aware of. There is a lot of mistrust generally in reaching out to the different sectors for support. And we know this from research, and we know this from reports from community members, just even in the current project that we're involved in, that there is a general mistrust based on history of, let's say, experiences with racism, history of perhaps not feeling that they received adequate culturally sensitive support, histories of feeling as if they were treated in a very stereotypical manner. And so there's a general concern, and we know from research that most survivors of intimate partner violence, or people who might be struggling in a family, are more likely to reach out to people that they feel that they can trust, and often that's informal supports. Right. So informal supports will look like, you've had other people I know on this show from their religious or faith-based, supports. They might go to an elder within the community. They might go, as a young person, I might talk to my friend. I'm more likely to tell what's going on in my, for example, if there's violence in my romantic relationship, I will open up to my friend, rather than go and tell my parents, for example. And so what needs to happen then is an effort where everyone in the community has the same message, so that when somebody approaches you, I know that I'm providing the right information, that I know that I'm linking them to resources that they will receive the kind of care and support that I would hope that they would receive.
And when we look at having everyone have the same, which is great that you mentioned that, we actually did some sessions in Calgary where we wanted to kind of take advantage and leverage the female elders in the community, and kind of empower them to say, hey, when people are having family issues, they might not necessarily go to those formal networks, but you as an informal support, you can really leverage your influence and provide support to them. And we said, this is empowering female elders, and they actually said, we're only 50, we're not elders.
But in our communities, because some of our communities are emerging and young, you're already in that role. So which is funny, they had wanted to change the name to Wise Women, which I found actually quite interesting, because as you mentioned, maybe for some of the younger generations, like, they won't go to a parent or to an elder, but they might go to a friend, which kind of opens it up that wise women can be someone of any age, not necessarily an elder. So like you said, it's very important that those that maybe are elders are sharing the same message as those that maybe are younger, who are still providing supports to, these family members or these community members. So I think that's great. But when we look at, go ahead. I was just going to say, it's really lovely that you mentioned that about, that why wisdom doesn't necessarily, traditionally we associate wisdom with age and experience and that, but there are sometimes people who show up with wisdom quite early, and often traditionally they were known. I had an opportunity quite a few years ago to spend some time talking with traditional healers and elders in my ancestral homeland in Tanzania.
Oh, awesome.
and particularly in the area where my father is from and where I was born as well. And one of the messages that I got from these conversations with healers and elders who were in their 90s at that time, they were talking about how they were selected. How did the community find them? And I said, what happened is that from a young age, you can begin to notice the individuals within the community from a young age who show particular qualities that they are going to be leaders at some point. And some of the work that I do, we talk about natural leaders, but there are young people who from a young age where they had particular sort of qualities where, first of all, they liked to sit and spend time with their elders. They were considered trustworthy. They were honest. They were individuals who wanted to learn about the culture and who they were. And generally, as they grew up, probably people gravitated towards them. And they held people's information with respect and care. And so those qualities were then nurtured in the community. until some of them ended up becoming, the elders.
Traditional healers.
And the elders.
Awesome.
Yeah. So it's like an apprenticeship, a lifelong apprenticeship, where you are learning and growing within that. And we have that as well. I mean, Yawa, we're looking at you, we're working with you, right? So this is something that that I think in our communities, we also need to recognize that we have our elders and the role that they play, and there are also some young leaders who have an important role to play as well in addressing this. There's some research that is showing intimate partner violence is happening amongst young people 100%. As well. It's not about sort of age, it's not about, so sometimes we think of it as in a married sort of couples relationship.
That's
so
where
we're
it
looking
only happens, right?
It can happen before. It can happen in elder ages, within couples relationships. And so this is something that I think having different people involved in prevention is really important.
Yes, no, I 100% agree. And I love that story of kind of the internship or lifelong apprenticeship of learning.
So it's just not 2-year diploma, no, or degree, no.
And this is a question that I love asking guests. If you could have, unlimited resources, where and something that I've learned in these conversations is the difference between prevention and intervention is that prevention is actually an investment. It's going to take time. And I think a lot of the time we're so focused on seeing results like overnight. But when we look at something like IPV, that's unrealistic to expect that, after an installation of a project that's a year long, we're going to see instant results and decreased rates, which is kind of the wrong expectations, which can lead to disappointment or lead us to being discouraged that, our efforts aren't working. So prevention is really an investment in the community. And I think we've been so caught up with the intervention because that's where we see, instant results. Someone comes in, we deal with the crisis ends, that looks like, progress, which in and of itself, might be. But for the long term, if we do want to see, a change in the community, it's important that we really hone into the prevention piece. So I love asking people, if you had unlimited resources where, time wasn't an issue, money wasn't an issue, the people weren't an issue, what would be the best design or a best practice of a prevention, a prevention resource or support for African Black or Caribbean communities in terms of reducing IPV, maybe from a mental health perspective?
Yeah, oh my goodness, you've given me
loaded question here. Yes,
well, mental health is intimately integrated into all aspects of people's lives. So if we're looking at this from prevention, I would say that, and we're looking at sort of people who've had the migrant experience, for example, and we know that more immigrants are coming, and then there'll be multiple generations going forward. Prevention would begin pre-migration.
Wow.
Where people would be informed and have adequate information prior to migration around some of the potential tensions and stresses that they might experience
when they come here,
before they come here. I think that that it's not about you're going to experience, tension in your relationship and there will be intimate partner violence.
Right.
But it's more about there are going to be some tensions and struggles and for example, particularly for immigrants who are choosing, have that choice. I think that we could have a whole other conversation, I think, around forced migration and the need for particular resources and supports around that. But when there has been a choice, I think to recognize that there are going to be some tensions that can really, we see that some of these are potential outcomes. People might not hear that, but at least that they would know that the lack of social supports is something that is a tension point for families. And so before you come, make contact and get to, if you can, we can do this now with social media, with the organizations or with community groups, so that you can begin to build those networks before
prior
you
to
arrive.
Coming, yes. That's a great point.
Don't end up isolated, because that is one of the underlying issues that happen is isolation. And even in abusive relationships, isolation is a tactic that's used. And so some of the early, because people talk about we weren't aware that we would experience these particular tensions, having some more information, because there is a body of research that's coming out that talks about, yes, what is wonderful and what is, the opportunities, but these are also some of the realities and challenges from the voices of people who are living here, and that I think is critical. And then once we arrive and once people are living here, prevention services that are wraparound, that are integrated into key kind of areas of integration that people face. Like, for example, we know that the main sort of areas that are critical to support integration are education, employment, housing, healthcare, community supports.
A big one.
And so weaving prevention strategies within these areas would be something that I think would be a sort of a way of recognizing that. And then we also know that there's some areas that are key kind of facilitators for people as they settle in and adjust to life in a new country. And these are around language and cultural kind of shifts. And so efforts to really address and improve and help people to learn language so that they can access resources. Help them to know what their rights are. Help them to recognize sort of the culture shifts and particular points of tension that can exist in changes that will happen. And this is, for example, just the changes that are going to happen to everyone when they immigrate into a new country. Yes, we live in a multicultural society, but the reality is when you come in, you're going to experience more of the changes than the broader society that you live in. And to recognize that that is likely to happen and that your children will also encounter this. And that the following subsequent generations will be more acculturated than the first generation. And what are the kind of tensions that arise particularly between the generations? And that's something that's come up a lot. Probably another conversation.
A whole nother conversation
around the intergenerational. But early understanding of this is really important. But not just early and not just as orientation, but it should be just naturally built in throughout.
And I think
our
that's a key point of what you said, the natural integration, rather than this is an IPV prevention service, come and utilize this, but with each kind of maybe settlement agency or whatever immigrant support there should be kind of intentional framework that, hey, if we introduce this, this is going to help reduce, IPV rates because we've set them up for success once they come here. And I think that's a key point.
And that's how it's integrated, intonated, coordinated throughout, and so mental health is prevented, mental health challenges are prevented, mental wellness is promoted. Because we have, employment services that will help people link to their, to careers and jobs and enhance families' financial, capacities. So all of those, so it's sort of it's a different way of thinking about mental health.
No, I love it.
This is a community sort of approach. And it is one that is addressing the social determinants of health. That intimate partner violence is, almost one of those outcomes, right?
And you mentioned earlier, and which kind of ties into this, within the formal supports, that there is a little bit of a mistrust within not even just immigrants specifically, but African, Black, and Caribbean, communities as a whole. There is kind of a lack of trust with these formal supports. So what strategies would you recommend to help either community organizations, formal services, anyone that wants to reach out or establish, relationship with these populations or these groups? What are some strategies of building that trust or reducing the mistrust that is preventing them and stopping them from getting services that are essentially there for them to benefit from?
Yes. So now when we sort of move into, are you talking about sort of formal types of supports?
Yes.
So let's say somebody does need counseling supports, and so, or a family counseling, and those kind of where people might be, so I definitely, there is a sort of a process of normalizing these supports that needs to happen. I would say, as somebody who's been in this field for more than 25 years now, it's always exciting for me to sort of sit where we're at right now and see that generally there's been a gradual sort of more openness to accessing and talking about mental health and accessing supports than perhaps in the past. And I think that's a factor of resources being provided to community organizations, to, as you know, the mental health program at Africa Center, where having those resources more visible over time, it makes it more normalized in our communities. Oftentimes, I think that in my experience just over the years, community members need to feel that they have a relationship with the organizations that are providing particular services. And that's how we begin to trust. It's a long, and that's why when we talk about resources and resources that are provided, they need to have this vision of a long-term involvement. Relationships are built slowly over time. Relationships of trust in particular are built slowly over time. If there are resources provided for mental health supports, they have to be continuous. And I think that generally, the ongoing visibility, the ongoing resources that are available, that I know that I can come to you, but a few years later, I remember I went to this particular organization. I can go back and I can be assured that, that program is still operating. It didn't close down because of funding, or the project ran out. And so I think that that long-term vision, that we plant a seed. The prevention work we're doing right now is tilling the soil and planting the seeds. The seed has to germinate before we begin to see, the fruit and the, of the work that we do. That's going to take time. And so coming back to sort of the point here, trust also takes time, and efforts to continue to kind of build relationships through different avenues, integrating like mental health. We have a fair on well baby clinics, for example, and we have mental health resources available there. We have somebody who's a mental health therapist come and talk a little bit about what they do. I can put a face to this work, and I've demystified it, and suddenly it looks familiar. I remember hearing about, in my country of origin maybe, that there were elders who provide similar services, or an aunt who I used to go to. And we have this built into this in through formal supports, as well as what we talked about earlier, the network of supports within the community.
Oh, that's awesome. So then, now that we've kind of laid the groundwork here, and I like that you mentioned that we've just planted the seed, because a lot of times we actually might not be the ones to water the seed or reap the fruit. We might be gone by that time. So it's really a long-term investment, and also it takes a village really for everyone to kind of be a part and have their hand in tilling the soil and tending to the gardens to ensure that we see the effects or the impacts of this project in the long run. So, and we know we can't do this just as a community alone. So what advice or what recommendations would you have for policymakers and stakeholders, because they also have a part to play in this entire project, or in the results that we're desiring to see? What recommendations and advice would you give to them in order to better improve the resources, the mental health resources for immigrants that could contribute to reducing intimate partner violence?
Yes. So I think sort of in recognizing that intimate partner violence affects everyone, and so efforts that are being done to address intimate partner violence we need to look at this also kind of as a broader community, and so some of what I say probably relates to both. But when we are looking specifically at our sort of African, Black, and Caribbean communities, because of what we've been talking about today, about some of the challenges that people have with accessing mainstream or services, mistrust, and what I'll say formal services, that people are more likely to go to informal services, recognizing that investing in programs like what we have to educate, to raise awareness within the communities is valuable investment of dollars. The economic cost of intimate partner violence is enormous, and so investing early on in some of these prevention programs is actually worthwhile. And so I would say that's critical. And that might look quite different from what people are used to. People might be used to, it might be a campaign where people, have posters and
Right.
and they might have some social media, which yes, we're doing that, but the relational component where people spend time having conversations similar to what's happening, for example, with the elder women right now, that is worthwhile also investing in, and that's really important, and that funding that can allow organizations to implement and evaluate over time the impacts is also going to be important. Recognizing it as what I've talked about earlier, that intimate partner violence, while we recognize that we focus on behavior, that we know that violence is about power,
Right.
that we're also looking at sort of what is happening behind all of this that also is causing this power imbalance within families that might be related to, we've talked about unemployment, maybe pressures around housing, education, addressing those concerns that are emerging within that community members have been talking about for quite a long time, is also well invested money in preventing intimate partner violence.
No, 100%. And hopefully we see these things kind of manifest as the project goes on or as the years go by. And just out of curiosity, you mentioned that from when you started early on in this field compared to now, things have changed for the better in terms of, receptiveness, mental health supports, especially for immigrants. What do you think has changed from back then to now in how immigrants have received or are willing to participate in mental health supports?
Exactly what I just said. Funds were put in place to develop programs. More resources towards mental health in the immigrant sector were provided. And I think that was critical. When I first started out, I had to volunteer for years because there wasn't funding
to pay
for professionals. And so the fact that there is funding for that, I think then you have people then who are able to make their own livelihood around mental health professional support, but also then there's visibility of members of our communities providing mental health supports, and that contributes again to destigmatizing mental health, recognizing that I can receive mental health supports that's more culturally sensitive and appropriate, that mental health supports are provided in a community context that I'm more familiar with. That is sort of more of a community model to addressing mental health. Of course, there's crisis.
Right.
And that is something that I don't want to minimize the importance of addressing crisis and mental health crises and the role of acute care in the larger sort of healthcare system. Today, I'm talking more specifically about community-based programming. And the importance of supporting those efforts, and I think that plays an important role. Another component for addressing mental health within the communities comes back to the idea of outreach. That reaching out to people rather than setting something up and waiting for them to come in.
Right.
Is not going to address sort of mental health challenges or intimate partner violence issues. So outreach is linked to prevention, and meeting people where they're at is critical. Yeah. So for example, going to a soccer tournament and talking about intimate partner violence there, is something that can be done if we think about that as being a way in which we do outreach.
And just before we wrap up here, that outreach is quite a big piece, because we find that if you wait for people to come, it's only those those early adopters or those brave few souls that will come, because there's still a lot of stigma and the taboo, and it still hasn't been demystified to the extent that we would like. So with the outreach, do you think there's a specific nuance in terms of outreach? Like, for example, can we just go around handing flyers, like, come to this intimate partner violence, domestic abuse, prevention program, or is there a more nuanced way to approach and outreach to these communities? Because I think even in my own programs, when it's either mental health or, the Enhancing Gender Equity program, it's kind of been difficult to engage people when we just outright say, okay, come talk about mental health or come talk about this topic. So what recommendations do you have around that?
So in the early days when, I feel like I'm putting myself in like a dinosaur here. In the early days, it wasn't that long ago. But at one point we had a program, some of the early work that sort of prior to the work that Dr. Phil and I are doing on intimate partner violence, we worked on sexual violence. And of course, that's even more
Right.
an area that we don't talk about. But in our work that we were doing around addressing sexual violence within at that time immigrant communities, and particularly addressing sexual violence where people had been exposed or impacted by sexual violence prior to migrating in the context of conflict, we know that happens hand in hand with conflict. And so the partnership that the group that I'd worked with was a number of community organizations, including the Sexual Assault Center, Multicultural Health Workers, Mennonite Center for Newcomers. But the outreach that we did at that time was very much sort of responsive to hearing where people feel they're safest to receive supports. And so a lot of the work that I did as a psychologist at that time was in people's homes. And so meeting people and working with them in their home, again, that was completely unheard of at that time. But this is a model of practice that is used by some community organizations, and it's become more of a standard practice in some ways. But that was building trust and reaching people where they're at. If I'm not safe in my home, where can I meet you
100%.
that you feel safe? Where can we meet? And so that was something that we did. The other thing that we did was reaching out to community groups. So we know in our community spaces, there's a lot of women tend to organize in groups. And so attending women's groups and more in a conversational, rather than I'm here to present to you about this topic, let's just talk generally. And this is who I am. I'm not going to hide what I do, but I'd like to talk about what's interesting to you at this point, and that I can see the links between that and let's say mental health. And so it's a little bit of a different way of approaching, but again, that's outreach, meeting people where they're at. We conducted some research with mental health professionals who were working with survivors of sexual violence at that time, and they said something that is relevant even to the work that we're doing right now. We asked them, what do survivors talk about when they come for therapy? I mean, I know about that because I was involved in that, but talking to other mental health service providers, what do they come in and say, I want to talk about this particular trauma, and or my intimate partner violence? What do they talk about? And what they said, it was similar to what I was hearing, is that, and I'm talking about women. When women came for counseling, they talked about, I need support with parenting. My children, I don't want to lose my children.
Right.
My relationship is really important. There's conflict here, or there's something going on that somehow my relationship with my children is affected. I want support with building my educational credentials, help me navigate and develop myself, so that I can stand on my own feet, so that I can have employment. Help me access employment services. And the fourth area was help me build community.
Wow.
Where can I connect community? So parenting, employment, education, and community. That's what women were telling us was important. And then, when they're ready, we go to the trauma.
Wow. So that's not even addressed at the forefront.
No.
Wow.
We follow where they want to go. We start with what's important to them. And it's addressing the underlying areas of tensions that they have.
Which are similar to IPV and contribute to IPV. Oh, wow.
Yes. And then from there, when they're ready. But we can address parenting, employment-related concerns, educational, issues, and community from a trauma-informed perspective.
So it's all it all kind of comes together.
So it all comes together. And when a person is ready to say, I want to really start to do some healing work around violence that I've experienced in my life, I have a trusting relationship with you because I know you care about me as a parent. You care about my future in terms of my employment prospects.
Right.
You care that I am a member of a community and you understand the concerns that I might have within my community around safety, around trust, and you've thought about that with me. Now we can go to what really matters.
That is amazing.
Maybe at this point, yeah.
And I think that's also has some cultural context to it, because as African, Black, and Caribbean people, that maybe aren't so familiar or comfortable talking about trauma and mental health,
Yes.
but they know, I want to keep my kids, I want to be able to work to provide for my family, I want to be able to be educated, and I want that social network, because we are collective people.
Yes.
So that's really coming from a cultural place, and then you just
Absolutely.
kind of really illustrated that beautifully, and I kind of see it all coming
and
together.
so what that takes us back to why then we invest in prevention, and why all of these areas are important. If you listen to people who are coming for counseling, they're talking about that as well, and that is therapy as well, and that is addressing, and that is my conflict that I'm having with my children, because perhaps my mental health is a fact. I'm dealing with my own mental health challenges. It's impacting my own ability to parent my child, or me not being able to work within my pre-migration profession. You know, I'm a nurse, and I haven't been able to work in my profession. That is actually trauma.
It is, yes,
for people.
Yes.
It's linked to the traumas that have threatened their sense of identity. It's threatened their relationships, their attachments. It's affected what's given them a sense of meaning and hope and a sense of justice. And so all of that, then, we are addressing those. We just have to sort of reframe how we think about the work that we do. And that, I think you're right, that is an Afrocentric approach.
No, that is amazing. Wow. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Sophie. There you have it, Dr. Sophie Yohani, everybody. What an amazing conversation. And I guess the last question for you here is, how can people continue to keep up with you after this conversation? You know, if they want to keep up with your latest research, maybe where you're doing a lecture or talking next, or just the works that you are going to be doing, you know, as a psychologist or a community-based, you know, practitioner. Where can they find you or keep up with you?
Yes, so we will have, I think, resources through our program available, so people can link that, so that they will be linked to my website.
Okay, awesome.
So that people can learn more about the work that I'm doing, and the collaborations that I'm involved in.
Awesome. Well, thank you again so much for taking the time to converse with me today and share your knowledge and expertise. And thank you all for watching and listening to Better Than the Cure, Preventing Intimate Partner Violence. Hopefully you were able to glean some knowledge, because there was a lot from Dr. Sophie Yohani today. And we look forward to sharing all the resources that we have, whether it's this podcast, the pamphlets, or other resources that we release through the Enhancing Gender Equity Project as they come out. It was a pleasure speaking with you, Dr. Sophie. And thank you all for tuning in. We'll see you all next time.
Thank you.